Putin's invasion of Ukraine has driven up gas prices and food prices all over the world. Your family budget, your ability to fill up your tank, none of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits genocide in half a world away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, now labeled a war criminal by many Western countries, is struggling for some kind of victory in Ukraine. His forces were badly mauled by Ukrainian defenders in northern Ukraine. Tens of thousands of troops are attempting to regroup and relaunch an assault to take eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are holding ground, fighting valiantly to repulse the gathering storm. Genocide? Well, President Biden says so. Putin is attempting to wipe out a nation of 44 million people. But the term may not fit the precise definition. It is certainly, by any standard, a horrific campaign to depopulate Ukraine. On this backstory, Ben Hodges, a lieutenant general, retired, who commanded U.S. forces in Europe. I've known Ben since he was a battalion commander in the 101st Airborne in Iraq. And we've seen this tragedy to eliminate civilian population centers before. In Chechnya, which I covered, including the brutal bombing and destruction of Grozny in 1999-2000, and Syria. So we talked to Hanna Notte at the Vienna Centre for Disarmament, who has studied the parallels between Syria and the current war in Ukraine, and Russian battle tactics, by no one's estimation, precise or humane. All right, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, was the former U.S. Army commander in Europe. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Dana. Thanks. Good to see you.
Look, it's good to talk to you because you have been right on the money on a lot of what has happened in Ukraine and so far ahead of others, I think, in understanding the battlefield there and what the Ukrainians were able to do. And, you know, it is a very confused picture on the battlefield now because we see the Russians regrouping, big masses of troops getting ready to push into the Donbass and the east. Can you put this in calculate this for me, how you think this is going to unfold in the battlefield, and can Ukrainian forces hold on?
So you're right. This is a new phase of the war. The Russians failed in every aspect of their first objectives. And so they have recalibrated what they think is achievable in the near term. They're looking at 9 May, the Victory Day, where they celebrate the end of World War II and have a huge parade every year in Red Square on May the 9th. I think that there's immense pressure to deliver some sort of positive victory-looking outcome before May 9th. So I think they're thinking in the near term, let's mass everything we have into finally finishing off Mariupol and getting all of Donbass, not just the part that they had before 24 February. These guys are brutal. They're correct some of the mistakes that they made, such as having one commander for the entire theater. That's a pretty important one. We'll see what happens below him. I imagine that they are scrambling right now to build what we damaged equipment, replacing manpower losses, leaders, all of that. That takes a few weeks to do, which I think represents an opportunity for Ukraine and for us.
They have what's called these battalion tactical groups, as I understand it. You'll understand this a lot better, being a military person. These are mixed groups of tanks and artillery and soldiers moving on the ground and maybe a rocket fire. People say that those battalion groups were badly mauled by the Ukrainians, and that if you just take a look at straight numbers of Russian forces, yes, they overwhelm Ukrainian troops. But if you actually take a look at what's left of those battalion groups now, a lot of military analysts say that there's not much left of some of them, and they are trying to reconstitute the other ones, and they are trying to bring in new recruits, a bit ragtag when you add it up militarily.
Well, certainly, if you don't have an existing infrastructure for doing reconstitution, it is going to be ragtag initially. The Germans in the Second World War were expert at rebuilding units and quickly rebuilding units that were able to hold off the Red Army for months at a time. I would not put the Russians today in the same category as the Germans in 1943 and 44. There is an interesting announcement that just came out from the Kremlin that they are not going to mobilize the reservists, which tells me that they're looking for volunteers. They're not getting many volunteers. They're looking for people even up to the age of 60 to drive trucks. I would unfortunately just miss that myself. I'm still over 60. But it's almost like they've said, okay, we think we can get Donbass, we can get Mariupol. We're going to focus on that. And then we'll wait a couple of years until the West loses interest again. And of course, knowing that they will have completely isolated Ukraine away from the Sea of Azov, then and the Ukrainian economy being in tatters, Russia can actually take a longer term view of this. So that's why I think it's important that we talk in terms of winning, doing everything we possibly can to help Ukraine win, which means smashing the Russian military before it can get back up on its feet. Otherwise, we will be dealing with this again for months to come.
So can President Zelensky settle for a ceasefire and allowing the Russians to hold the Donbass and maybe cut off the country from the Black Sea and certainly the Sea of Azov? I mean, can he actually settle for that then?
Well, of course, this is going to be a sovereign decision for the Ukrainian government. I don't believe that he wants to do that. I don't believe that domestically, politically, he can do that. I don't think there's any appetite in Russia. I'm sorry. I don't believe there's any appetite in Ukraine for doing something like that. I mean, every day we hear about more murders or bodies being dug up that were murdered by Russian soldiers. I'm sure we're going to keep finding more of these. So I think the Ukrainian people are not willing to settle for that. Now, I can't speak for a mother whose son is in huge danger, but my sense from listening to members of the Rada, from Ukrainian journalists, and then from President Zelensky himself, you don't get the sense that they're looking for any settlement just to stop this. And candidly, I don't think that that is not the ultimate objective. The priority has got to be those categories or aspects of winning that I described, and that should be the priority for the United States also.
Last question to you, Ben. You're an expert on NATO. Do you think that there's been a lot of movement now in what NATO is willing to do? Yesterday, we heard that maybe Slovakia independently will send some of its MiGs, and that the U.S. may say okay this time, whereas they said no to supplying MiGs through the NATO U.S. base in Germany. But it looks like as the horror of this increases, NATO's appetite and willingness to supply bigger arms and more of them and different kind of even offensive arms rather than just defensive as they were termed before changes by the minute.
Yeah, I think that there is a growing momentum actually for nations to do things, and the United States has at least gotten out of the way. If somebody wants to provide something, whether it's the Czechs or whatever, or the Slovakians, that we're not interfering with that, which I think is an important step. It was a fiasco with these MiGs from Poland, both the way it was handled as well as the outcome. And I think that we were making policy decisions based on an exaggerated fear of what might happen, like an escalation or a World War III type thing. I think those fears were exaggerated, and there's a growing recognition that perhaps we do need to do more than just keep Ukraine in the fight. And nobody wants to be a party to allowing or enabling the continued murder of innocent people.
Ben Hodges, so great to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Dana, thanks always for the opportunity you give me.
All right, Hanna Notte is a senior research associate at the Vienna Centre for Disarmament and NonProliferation, which means she knows a lot of stuff about nuclear weapons and all of that stuff. So, Hanna, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Is it?
Glad to be joining.
Yeah, good to talk to you. Do you believe this Swedish television report that Russian jets armed with nuclear weapons penetrated Swedish airspace and had to be intercepted earlier this month? And how serious is that?
I saw those reports, Dana. I think that they are entirely credible. I find it conceivable that at this time, Russia would engage in such acts of brinkmanship in the sort of broader European theater to mark its red lines vis-a-vis NATO, not to engage in the Ukraine conflict beyond what we're currently seeing. And so I don't have any additional information on that, but I find it entirely conceivable. It is dangerous, but I think that NATO, the United States, have so far acted very cautiously and very professionally in the face of such Russian brinkmanship.
You've been to Moscow, and you've studied President Putin, maybe not as your field of study, but there's a lot of things that have happened in Russian foreign policy and nuclear proliferation, and all under Putin's watch. Is he the Russian leader you thought he was, given what's going on in Ukraine?
I have to say that up until the invasion on February 24th, and in fact, I was in Moscow until February 23rd, so the day before the war started, I was, like many, hoping that the buildup of troops around Ukraine, the hostile rhetoric, the Russian kind of difficult negotiating position on the security guarantees that it put forward were all part of coercive diplomacy to see what one could get at the negotiating table from NATO, from the United States. And so in that sense, I was surprised by this invasion. With hindsight, going back to the speeches that he gave, the kind of rhetoric that we've seen from him on Ukraine, which clearly indicate for years that he just simply does not see Ukraine as an independent nation. Perhaps we should have, read those kinds of speeches with greater concern and seen them more as a warning than we did.
Is this some kind of evolution of President Putin, do you think, and especially maybe a more compressed one in the last 2 years where he's been more isolated in the pandemic? Do you think that these are all kind of natural positions that he would take, given the statements that he's made in the past about, the great catastrophe of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he has spoken out against NATO enlargement? I mean, he's kind of gone from first gear to fourth pretty quickly, though.
I agree with that, Dana. I think there has been an evolution in the man Putin. I don't think that he was always hell-bent on doing what he's doing now. In fact, I do believe that when he first came to power, perhaps in the early 2000s, there were even opportunities of constructing a different kind of relationship with this Russian Federation under Putin after 9/11, for instance. And then certainly, the reason that we're now seeing this invasion has also to do with his reading of the international situation. So there's been a hardening of Putin's stance, I would say, over the last few years. And then there's been this added calculation, I believe, that we have a new president, or relatively new US president in the White House, withdrew from Afghanistan, is very focused on China. So I think that Putin did not anticipate the kind of American attention and NATO unity that we're now seeing. Perhaps he thought, okay, Merkel is leaving the office in Germany. We have a new German government that's still figuring out its bearings. So perhaps the Europeans won't have leadership, will be distracted. So I do believe that the reading of the international situation, plus the hardening of his own position, perhaps his thinking about his legacy, the kinds of things he wants to accomplish before he leaves the Russian scene, having done a lot of that domestically in the last few years by sort of decimating the Russian opposition, now turning his attention to the international tasks, that all of these things came together.
With one goal being the restoration of the Soviet Union, or the restoration of an imperial Russia that is so far undefined?
I think it's neither of those completely capture it. I think it's sort of Russia certainly perceives an entitlement to a sphere of privileged influence in its immediate neighborhood, wants a buffer zone, between itself and NATO, and therefore Belarus and Ukraine form an important part of that. And so, as to whether Russia would necessarily go further than that, I don't think that is necessarily what President Putin thinks Russia needs for its national security. I think what he certainly wants is the destabilization of European societies, sowing division, and so it can do a lot of that with hybrid means, with disinformation. Not necessarily needs to invade other countries beyond Ukraine, and I believe probably won't have the military bandwidth to do so anyway anytime soon.
Not now. I mean, a lot of people think that they have failed so badly in Ukraine. If it's any kind of an example for the Kremlin, it's, you can't go any further because you didn't even get this far. And whether he wants to have this buffer zone, it's a buffer zone right now of the unwilling, that he seems, prepared. Pardon my coarse statement here. He seems prepared to pave it if he can't win it over.
And that's the big concern. I agree with you going forward, how far Putin's willing to go in Ukraine in terms of the military means that he's prepared to undertake if he doesn't achieve gains that at least will allow him to negotiate with the Ukrainians from a position of strength at the negotiating table. And right now he is not able to do that.
Okay, let's talk about how far he is willing to go, because I covered his war in Chechnya, and he was willing to do anything, quite frankly, including using fuel air bombs in cities, which he has done now, and he has used cluster munitions, and he has used this heavy shelling and bombing to the point of just basically destroying any kind of infrastructure in depopulation. So that is why I became so interested in some of the things that you've written about, where you're drawing parallels with Syria. And, in a way, Mariupol mirrors what we saw in Aleppo to some degree. So you talked about 5 parallels with Syria. The first one, you said sequential war. Can you lead me through that?
That's right. Yeah, sure, Dana. So if you look at Syria, and we got to go back a couple of years, the Russian government, which was, of course, militarily supporting the Assad government starting in 2015, what you saw in 2016, 2017 was that they declared some de-escalation zones. That's what they called them in western parts of the country. Ceasefires were declared. The Assad government was then enabled to turn its attention further east, take more territory. And then eventually the Russians and the Syrians came back to those de-escalation zones, Eastern Ghouta, Homs, Dera, in 2018, and basically said, now we'll take these territories over. So, as I was thinking through whether something similar might be possible in Ukraine, of course, one has to acknowledge that the Ukraine campaign is a very different ballgame. I'm not necessarily saying that we will see a similar sequencing here, but certainly I think we should say the mere fact that the Russians are declaring phase 1 over, focus on the quote unquote liberation of the Donbass, and we're seeing some forces pulling back from around Kiev, shouldn't give us too much cause for optimism that the fighting there is over. I mean, in fact, I believe we saw yesterday that some military attacks on Kiev and around Chernihiv actually prevailed. So it's mostly sort of a cautionary note to say that when Russia announces these phases, the game is not yet over necessarily.
Right. And if you were a military commander on the ground for Ukraine, then you probably would have to think twice about allowing those troops to withdraw peacefully, because you know very well that they may regroup. I mean, if the Syrian model applies, they may regroup in Belarus, and you may be facing them in a few months' time again.
That's right. And I think what we're also seeing is that certainly not all Russian troops will withdraw from the north and from around Kiev, because they don't want to give the Ukrainians the bandwidth to move all their forces towards the east either, because they want to, have the military upper hand there. So I think we have to look at these things very, very carefully going forward.
Talk to me about encirclement and corridors. I mean, I feel like I'm watching an old siege of a town by the Romans, and that military tacticians haven't evolved very much, but what they're doing is inhuman but very effective.
Dana, I think the most infamous siege that we can recall from the Syria campaign was the siege of Aleppo in 2016, which lasted for, I think, over 6 months. And, the population there, similarly to the terrible news we're hearing now from Mariupol, was deprived of food, of water, of sort of basic needs. The Russians eventually provided humanitarian corridors there, but those were often hampered by violence. Civilians distrusted these corridors because there was very minimal international oversight of sort of securing them. And so I think a lot of people didn't leave. And if we look at the timeline of the siege of Mariupol to date, I believe we've had, and I just sort of went back to check this, I think we had humanitarian corridors being declared twice. On March 5th was the first one, but there quickly the ceasefire also collapsed and then a safe corridor couldn't be established. Then we had another one, I believe in mid-March, and then I believe we have a ceasefire being declared today. So there's another hope on the Ukrainian side that you can bring some people out. But let's not forget, 170,000 people are estimated to remain trapped in Mariupol. And so there's
you have to pause for a sec, right? And you have to think about, not you, but we have to think about that number. Because when you look at that rubble, you cannot imagine that somewhere in it, under it, there are 170,000 people who still remain behind from what was a city of 500,000.
That's right. And the concern is not just about the viability and the safety of establishing corridors to bring people out. There's another example from the Syria campaign I'd like to draw the attention to, because we always hear the Aleppo comparison, but what you had with the humanitarian corridors from the de-escalation zones in 2018 from, for instance, the suburbs of Damascus, Eastern Ghouta, was a Russian rhetoric that said, people may leave, we have the corridors now, but those who stay will effectively enmesh themselves with the terrorists and hence become legitimate targets for when military activity resumes. And that is also, I think, a sort of a warning to us all that, you know, we might see a sort of similar rhetoric.
If you don't get out, you're a terrorist. And if you stay behind, you're a target. But you can't get out. You know, women and children cannot get out, and older people cannot. And a lot of older people just don't want to go. They don't know where to go.
And Dana, on the you can't get out, here's another parallel that we're seeing between Syria and Ukraine. Now, Russia claims that all civilians are free to leave. And the reason that they may not leave is because they are used as human shields by the enemy on the ground. So in Syria, for years, the Russians would often claim that the terrorist groups, quote unquote, on the ground would keep civilians as human shields and prevent them from leaving. And on Mariupol, we've seen the same Russian rhetoric in briefings from the Russian Defense Ministry, where they say we have 7,000 Azov fighters and sort of right sector battalions in Mariupol, and they are also using the civilians as human shields. I think Putin even said it himself in some of his remarks in early March. So there's another parallel for you there.
All right, so there's three of the five: sequential war, encirclement and corridors, and human shield. And then you move on to the fourth, which is foreign fighters.
That's right. I mean, it's foreign fighters, and actually one could add mercenaries. So one thing I'd like to point out is that we had a private military company, Wagner, present in Syria at various stages during the war. This is a Russian PMC. And there have been reports sort of anecdotally about PMC Wagner also appearing in Ukraine, though those are very hard to corroborate. And then we have the whole issue of foreign fighters, which is actually sort of multi-layered. So on the one hand, Russia argues against foreign fighters. It says in Syria, foreign fighters intervened to join the armed opposition to precipitate regime change, and Russia had to intervene to, prevent the regime from falling. So it was sort of making a claim about the internationalization of that conflict. Similarly, in Ukraine, the Russians have claimed that thousands of quote unquote foreign mercenaries and terrorists have joined the armed forces of Ukraine. And so they are to be ruthlessly destroyed. That's how the Russian military put it last week. Yet at the same time, Russia itself wants to use foreign fighters in that war. I mean, that's the sort of perfidy of the situation.
And the reports are that they've recruited some 16,000. Nobody can confirm those numbers, right? And they're paying them people that will fight from Libya, from Syria. Chechnya, by the way, is not a foreign fighter because they are Russian. That is a Russian enclave.
That's right.
But yeah, there you have these 16,000, if it's that many, with probably debatable results as to whether they would really impact what's happening on the ground anyway.
So Dana, I was actually looking at this issue in a little more detail, and I was sort of surprised to see what I found so far, which is, yes, you had this initial announcement. We have 16,000 who are willing to join us from the Middle East, specifically from Syria. Russian TV was playing these propaganda videos showing Syrians signing up at Tartus and the port of Latakia to join Russia. And then I believe the Pentagon CENTCOM reported that they were actually not seeing any movements from Syria to Ukraine, perhaps in just very, very small numbers. And then at the defense ministry briefing, a Russian defense ministry briefing last week, there was this curious line where they said, we offered 23,000 foreigners who could join us in this fight. But in fact, the leadership of Donetsk and Lugansk told us they prefer to defend their land themselves. So the Russians appear to have walked back from this idea of deploying Syrians.
What's the translation there? They offered people their $5,000 and they wouldn't come?
Well, I was thinking about this. So I think there's a few possibilities here. The most immediate that comes to mind is that perhaps now that the Russians had to realize they cannot encircle Kiev, they have to recalibrate their military operation. Perhaps they see no useful military role for the Syrians at this point in the war, which might change later. Perhaps there's a sort of logistical challenge in moving these fighters from Syria to Ukraine, as you're already kind of very much challenged with this operation. Here's a third thought. I mean, Russia has established itself in Syria, and I believe it wants to preserve its existing gains in that country because it's a base for power projection into the Middle East. I also think you don't want to pull too many Syrian fighters away from Syria, where you still have pockets of instability and lots of problems, because it could create a vacuum in Syria. It could be a combination of those factors. But so far, these are sort of my ideas as to why we're not seeing that kind of movement.
All right. And then number 5 on Hanna's list is chemical weapon claims. And this is a war not only of soldiers on the ground, but it's an information war.
That's right. So again, a parallel to Syria. In Syria, the Russian military has for years warned against those so-called false flag chemical attacks to be conducted by armed groups with the purpose of blaming them on the Syrian government or on Russia by extension, drawing in a Western response. We've seen that same rhetoric resurfacing in Ukraine. Now, actually, of course, with Ukraine, we have to note that really the disinformation and the propaganda has not just related to chemical weapons. It's really spanned the whole spectrum of WMD, with Russia also talking about about Ukraine developing a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb, a radiological bomb. So it's really gone all the way. The fear on the Ukrainian side and among Western governments has been that Russia would engage in that kind of rhetoric in order to create a pretext to then use a chemical weapon in Ukraine itself. Yeah. This is difficult to make any kinds of predictions on such a difficult question.
But there are a lot of chemical weapons experts in Britain and in the U.S. Who believe, number one, Russia has the ability, because we've seen their deployment of Novichok abroad. They still retain chemical biological weapons facilities, and that in desperation, if they were going for regime change in Kiev, the fear was that, in fact, they would deploy it on the city to create, basically terror on the ground, because that is how you depopulate a city in the most extreme, inhumane, but very effective way.
That's right, Dana. To your first point, now, let's not forget that Russia completed its own chemical disarmament under supervision of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, in 2017. But the United States State Department has declared Russia in non-compliance, in violation with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention ever since. It's down.
And the OPCW, as I understand it, has not been able to get in there since the deployment of Novichok, which was used domestically, which was used in Salisbury, and elsewhere.
That's right. That's right. So basically, after the poisoning of Alexei Navalny in the fall of 2020, the OPCW has really been trying very hard to get to an agreement with the Russian Federation to send what's called a technical assistance mission into Russia to investigate what actually happened there. But no agreement was reached with the Russians because they've basically been stalling. So it's essentially impossible for the OPCW to verify what kind of chemical weapons Russia might still have. Then regarding your point as to whether the Russians could calculate that the use of such a heinous weapon could serve them militarily, I agree with you that, you know, once you move into a war of attrition and you want to wear down a population over time, create terror. I mean, this is how the Syrian government used chemical weapons in Syria. It was very much enmeshed with its conventional campaign of punishment of a sort of population in enemy territory, wearing them down with indiscriminate bombing, sieges plus chemical weapons. And so, I mean, this is what we know about the use of chemical weapons as a military tool from past conflicts. And of course, yes, the fear is that we could see something similar in Ukraine. But allow me to make one final point here, which is that even if Russia does not intend to use chemical weapons in Ukraine, this false flag rhetoric, propaganda, still serves a purpose for Moscow. I think, first of all, it sustains this domestic narrative that a WMD threat is emanating from Ukraine, hence the need for this preventive, quote unquote, special military operation. So you justify the war to your own people. Certainly, it creates terror and fear in Ukraine among people, which is already useful without you using the weapon.
You're right. I mean, in fact, some people may have fled just based on these threats. We don't know, right?
That's right. And then finally, let's not forget that the Russian disinformation on WMD in Ukraine is also picked up by conspiracy theorists in the West. And so this is, I think, part of a larger disinformation play of wanting to sow doubts and division in Western societies. And you can just do that at very little cost.
You have lots of conversations with strategic people when it comes to nuclear weapons. What do you think the West's response would be if a tactical weapon was deployed in Ukraine?
It's a very good question. We don't know for sure, I think, how NATO would react to the use of such a weapon. We would be in.
Does that mean that NATO doesn't know either? I mean, that they would have to react quickly, I assume, because yes, this is a strategic threat to Europe.
Yes.
And I would think that they would have a plan in place. And yet we hear behind the scenes there's a lot of planning, formation of special planning groups at the White House, at the National Security Council, and that I think that NATO doesn't have a plan. I think they don't have a plan.
Dana, I'll be honest, I don't know. I've thought through this question myself. I'm not convinced that if we were to see the use of a Russian tactical weapon inside Ukraine or even beyond Ukraine, we would necessarily see a nuclear response by NATO. Certainly, if such a weapon is used in Ukraine, we might not see a nuclear response because it's not NATO territory. Would we see a very harsh conventional response? It's a good question. I mean, so far the line has been very clear from NATO that as long as this conflict doesn't, touch NATO territory, we will not get militarily involved. But I'm sure folks must be having these conversations right now about the what if.
You've been very generous with your time. Just one last question, if you'll permit me, and that is, as I see this unfolding, I think that the media likes to tie these things up with a quick bow and say, well, it'll be over in a few weeks. They're moving. Negotiations look positive. Ukraine has made certain, promises of demilitarization, with guarantors and a neutral state, non-nuclear. But given Putin's past, it seems to me he wants a bigger victory than that. And he may not get one, but he has some time to go here before maybe he realizes that. And that this could go on. What's your estimate? Months? Years?
Definitely months. I don't think anything's over anytime soon. I wasn't left particularly optimistic after the latest talks in Turkey, because to me, seeing what's on the table, I mean, regarding the security guarantees that Ukraine is demanding, I don't see at all a Russian willingness to even begin to consider those, because Ukraine wants essentially enhanced NATO Article 5 guarantees with Western guarantors willing to step in if there's renewed aggression by Russia. How Russia could accept that, I fail to see. Then there's the question over territorial claims where, yes, the two sides say we'll leave Crimea to be negotiated over the next 15 years. But regarding the Donbas, it's very clear. I mean, Lavrov, I think, said it yesterday. That issue is settled for good. The Russians seem to assume that the Donbas in its current borders, which is three times, I think, the size of territory prior to February 24th.
Yeah, although up to the Dnieper River, I mean, it's a huge territory.
That's non-negotiable to the Ukrainians. So I think an agreement is not likely in the short term. I think that the Russians think they can achieve more success in the East in this new phase of the war to strengthen them at the negotiating table vis-a-vis Kiev. And then, of course, Dana, the big question is, what does Putin know about all of this? I mean, we've had some information in recent days that perhaps military leaders and the defense ministry are not fully informing him about the extent of losses, about how the campaign is going. So he might have a skewed picture and might think that things are going better than he's being told. So I guess, but I agree with you. He took this drastic decision to launch this invasion, and he will not walk away from the situation easily with something that he cannot that he cannot characterize as victory.
Skewed picture. Nice way to say Putin is delusional at best, I think, but skewed picture, definitely. Hanna Notte with the Vienna Centre for Disarmament and NonProliferation. Hanna, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory on the war in Ukraine. As I record this, the Russian warship Moskva was abandoned off Ukraine's coast after a fire. The Ukrainians say they hit it with missiles. Russia is warning it will strike Kiev government buildings if sabotage attacks continue inside Russia. And more evidence of war crimes in Bucha and Mariupol and elsewhere by Russian forces. More arms are on their way to Ukraine, because Western powers and Ukrainian leaders believe the only way to stop this bloodshed and destruction is to defeat Russia on the battlefield. If you want more on Ukraine, subscribe for free to my backstory newsletter, danalewis.substack.com, and I'll write to you there or here on Backstory Podcast. I'll talk to you again soon.